Hello, my name is Michaela O'Connor Abrams, founder of Mocha Plus. Welcome to our Collective Conscience series. We created this series for you to bring together great minds from around the world on myriad topics that we hope will expand your mind, will challenge your current beliefs, and give you an opportunity to be inspired with every video. Enjoy. Karlee and I connected immediately on one very important aspect of our lives, and that is that we both, at a young age, okay, she younger than I at that point, lost our partners. And that gives someone a connection that's not only indelible, but that immediately you find informs the next number of questions, of time together, of ways in which we look at life. And not all at all through a lens of sadness, but through a lens of great experience and learning from that time. So I'll share that part of our messy journey together. And then Karlee, ask you to please share with everybody how you started, and you've been amazingly successful. And I'm going to prompt you to talk about a few of those stories. But first, just give us that first look at what this is.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me in the room with everybody tonight. This is such a gift. And 36 consecutive Mondays, that's extraordinary, especially right now. So I appreciate that we're not squandering this crisis, that you're finding a way to create the silver lining or create the and, right? There's this coronavirus and there's this opportunity for us to come together, and maybe we would have been too busy or had too many other things going on. The fact that we could all be in the same room, that's a cause for celebration. So thank you for letting me be here tonight. I say we start right with the good stuff, Michaela, because you brought up kind of the heavy hit moment that was a quick unifier for us. So the podcast is called Messy and Magnificent, and it's born of this coaching practice that I've had for the last 14 years. We help kind of high profile entrepreneurs and everyday rock stars thrive through nourishment instead of punishment. We help them reclaim their time and create careers in alignment with their values. And a great example of that was my former fiance, Adam. So probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I was on a tour with a particular client because at that time, the model of my business was such that I would be the live-in coach to one highfalutin person at a time. So I would be on the jet with them, I'm living on their tour bus, I'm in the green room for every late night show, or on the side of their stage, kind of part of their entourage. And my favorite part of that job was after the show, and many of you probably know, many artists don't make their money from the albums, they make their money from performing, right? And ticket sales and special events. And so after most big shows, there'd be like a club or some type of social engagement where a lot of my clients would get paid to make an appearance, make a performance. And I loved those hours because they were the middle of the night. And I would know for those few hours while my rock star clients were partying, I could be left alone on the tour bus to hopefully get a little bit of sleep. And that's exactly what happened this one particular night. Now, Adam was a professional skateboarder, my former fiance. And my client at the time had hired Adam because he wanted to learn how to skateboard. And so it was Adam's first tour on this type of circuit. And so everybody goes through the VIP line. They're going through those red ropes to get to the VIP section to go party in the club. And I'm grabbing my blanket out of my rack and I'm bringing it to the super tacky red leather sofa. This was Lil Wayne's tour bus. I lived with Wayne for years. And so I bring my blanket to one end of this tacky red sofa, and Adam brings his to the other, and we sit there and we're just meeting each other. We don't even know that we're gonna fall in love and be engaged one day. And I said to Adam, "How's it going, buddy? How's your first tour? What does it feel like to be you right now?" And he said, "Karlee, I am exhausted and I'm having the time of my life." And in that moment, Adam used the word and in a way that I had been studying for years through the field of positive psychology, been studying the folks who are able to be resilient, who are able to do well even during times of challenge. And one thing we've learned about them is that they're able to incorporate the concept of and. Something can be really difficult or tricky and hard, and we can put our toes in the pond of what's good. Both are real and both are true. So all this happens, years go by, Adam and I fall in love. And now it's years later. I'm on an airplane, actually about to fly out to Silicon Valley for a tech conference, when I got the message that Adam passed away. Somebody called me, and they called me just as we're about to take off. So the flight attendant sees me on my phone and says, "Ma'am, you need to put the phone down. We're about to take off." And I happened to be traveling with a colleague of mine that I didn't get along with particularly well. But he could tell that something was wrong. And I thought I was shaking because the jet engines were going, but it wasn't that. It was something within me. I had no words. This tremble, and water was leaking out of my eyes. And this guy that I never saw eye to eye with looked over and held my hand for the first 30 minutes of that flight. Here I am on a 6-hour flight from New York City to LA, not having an easy way to communicate with anybody about the insane news that I just got. And this human being knew that I needed to hold somebody's hand. And I knew in that moment, the "and" was this holding of the hand. There was no part of my day that was going to be better than that. And it wasn't great. I didn't want to hold the hand of this guy, but I needed to hold something. And so I say all of this because when we were creating Messy and Magnificent, we knew that we wanted to create a community for driven folks, a lot of them being women. We work with a lot of women these days, where there would be space to be fully who we are. I'm curious for anybody here if this is relatable, but for a lot of the driven folks that I work with that are career motivated, there's this sense of what we call popular isolation. And that's just a phrase we've coined that describes what it's like to be the go-to person for everybody. Maybe you've got good friends or good family and good coworkers, people that you love and they love you back. And yet there's this sense of the weight of the world being on your shoulders. There's this sense that nobody has any idea how much you need to do to get through the day. And everybody else might be impressed with what you're getting done, and you feel secretly behind because you know you're capable of more, but when are you supposed to have the time to get to that? And conversation after conversation, one-on-one with all these driven people, made it super clear to me that a lot of folks feel isolated. And the only way we were going to be able to do something about that was to create community. And that's where Messy and Magnificent was born. Because to your point, Michaela, when we were talking earlier, it's the mess that allows us the human connection that leads to magnificence. And I think of all the work that, say, Brene Brown does around vulnerability, where we found that time and time again, it's shared human vulnerability that allows us to form meaningful connections. And so that's where it all came from. And I appreciate that you would start right with the mess, Michaela. You're my kind of woman to just go right there from the top.
Well, I mean, I'd be remiss then if I didn't say and let everybody know that you were so gracious to allow us to have you tonight, because you were moving your entire home and finished that somewhere around noon today. And so what we're looking at is a newly moved into house that I'm sure was messy this morning, and now it's magnificent. So there are so many ways that your title applies. So Karlee, you have a really successful podcast about this, and you look at this from many, many angles, right? Because having been the coach and really kind of, I think of it very much as leader of the spirit of each of these rock stars that you traveled with, and through planes and trains and automobiles. That you found that this sense of success and them loving what they do still had this incredible challenge to really stay grounded, to keep boundaries, to do all the things that, as you and I also discussed, well, so often many of the people in your community are women. We talk about the fact that for all of us kind of to rise, right, men are a really important part of the equation. whether it's in partnership or as allies to other women, that relationship between the two is really critical. So as it regards that, what have you found from, you can use any example you like of people with whom you worked the most and traveled this insane amount that gave you the ideas to take it through to other clients?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, here's the honest truth. I remember being at 30,000 feet, and I won't name this particular client because it's not the greatest story on their behalf. But I'm on a jet with a client, and they've got their private chef is in the back, making the food. They've got 4 or 5 assistants arranging for the SUVs to pick us up, at the airport and take us to the hotel and the venue. They've got their manager, doing all the last minute arrangements for their performance that night. And they leaned into me, Karlee, and they said, "I'm just so miserable. I don't know what to do. All of these people are counting on me, and I'm just so miserable." And I remember really buying into that. I sipped the Kool-Aid of that belief system with a lot of my clients, that their lives were really hard, that it was really difficult to find joy and to find meaning when they had all these demands on them. But one day I'm on the plane and it occurred to me, well, all of this is true. And this particular client that was giving me, the woe is me story brings in about $20 million a year just in royalties alone. So that's if they stopped making any work. They would still have, a good amount of revenue coming in every year. And I thought, what about the everyday rock stars? Like, what about the people that don't have an entourage and don't have a plane and are just trying to navigate what we call the big three, which is having a thriving career and health and relationships all at the same time? Because at our core, we know this logically, that we're all the same in many ways at our core, that we all have similar desires. But not everybody is willing to be a pioneer of discomfort, meaning willing to do the work of figuring out what really needs to be tended here too, right? Like for us high achievers, doing the long hours, underselling and over delivering, being perfectionists about our work, that's not the hard part for us. That's what comes naturally. The hard part is softening the armor. The hard part is daring in a world that runs on Duncan to slow down and consider another way, and all the things that bubble up. And so an example of this would be, so one particular client that I toured with, I think we did 2 tours together, Drake is the artist. Now, when you're on tour with a bunch of clients, you get this spiral bound notebook. I wish I had one here. I've saved a bunch of them. That gives you the play-by-play of which hotel you're going to be at on which day. So everybody in the entourage gets this. Here's the hotel, here's the nearest dry cleaners, here's the grocery store, here's the CVS, all the things you need to know in each town, because you might only be there for a few hours. But Drake had a tour book with a specific addendum that I had never seen before. On the cover of Drake's tour book is an addendum that says, "We are a family. We will never raise our voices to one another. We are here working in community. This is an opportunity for us to rise together." And I had never seen in any artist that I'd ever worked with such a clear call to their values. And that regardless of the size, and of course, he's a big deal these days, that they were going to be clear that they were going to take care of themselves as much as they would be offering work out into the world. And that was an aha moment, because I realized there is nobody else that I'm working with right now that operates from those types of values. I want to go work with people who have what the field of positive psychology would call P plus M. Their equation is P plus M equals T, which stands for pleasure plus meaning equals thriving. So when I'm at 30,000 feet with this one particular client who's got pleasure out the wazoo and is still unfulfilled, it's because meaning is lacking. And they weren't willing to do the real work of sitting with, why is that? And what do I care about? And for a lot of us, we have meaning out the wazoo. Good-hearted people, those of us who would show up for this kind of conversation, we've got meaning. We love being of service. We love showing up for other people. But we find that if we don't tend to our pleasure component or our sense of joy, then we also don't thrive. And so I knew that there had to be a way, again, for this and. How can we not be fragments? How can we not be extremists, all one way or the other? Where's the middle ground, right? Messy, magnificent, pleasure, meaning, all these things that make us whole beings rather than fragments.
Well, and to that end, there's something very true about this pandemic, no matter what stage of life one is in, that it has changed the equation and in many ways not dictated it, but thrown it up in the air and said to each of us, again, whether you're 22 or 72, that you get to decide how you're putting the marbles back in the jar. Another favorite metaphor I have that I used to use with my staff all the time. We're going to dump all the jars, all the jars. We're dumping all the marbles out of the jar and we're going to put them back one at a time. And if 90% of them end back in the jar that way, well, then that was meant to be. But we're going to do it to make sure that no one ever says or ever feels that we're doing it because that's the way we've always done it. And I think we have that opportunity. And as I listened to some of your other podcasts and guests, I thought it seems to be true universally that from this first point in the pandemic of just kind of, oh my God, you're kidding me. And then let's just add social injustice and California way, 4 million acres of our state burned and the election and everything else. And it just became really, really hard for people to just feel okay until they had a chance to say, and okay, this all sucks, pardon me for just putting it that way. And what opportunity does it give me to do something, to achieve something, to make something happen, to put together an old relationship and a friendship that I hadn't tended to because I was too busy, and what are those? And so I'm curious in the podcast and your upcoming book that I want you to write after we had that last talk, what you think people who now have gotten to the end, okay, I'm getting it, we're going to be in this even longer, so I'm going to do and. How do you do and still keep those boundaries? So as you just talked about the equation, that's possible.
If I could answer that in one word, it would be grace. We extend ourselves some grace, right? That's how we live into the and right now. Grace for ourselves, hopefully a little bit of grace for everybody else, and that we're all in this together, for better or worse. We're navigating some uncharted territory. And this is an opportunity to practice grace. And to your point, Michaela, boundaries were important before. Now boundaries, you need like ninja-like skills to implement boundaries. And for those of us, Ellen, my amazing right hand is here. She was talking before we hopped on live. She had to implement boundaries with her family because she's working from home now, right? And so guys, you can't come into the kitchen while I'm on this call. These are the rules, right? And there's nothing like living on a tour bus, sleeping on a rack of 3 people with 2 300-pound security guards, one sleeping above you and one sleeping below you, to help you get really good at making boundaries. Like that was the incubator for boundaries. And I'm about to live with a bunch of rock stars for a few months at a time. If you can have any fulcrum of boundary during that moment. And I think that's what's really important, was that the boundaries I might have as an independent human being living in my own home are going to be modified when I'm on a tour bus. Right? There's going to have to be a little bit of grace. And I think for those of us during this time of COVID, it's the same thing. These are my normal rules, my normal thought process, my normal work. And this is what it needs to look like during this time of COVID. And I don't know if it would be helpful, but there's these, we've been calling them the 3 H's of COVID response for high achievers, because these are things that we're watching with almost everybody that we work with. And I'd be so curious for anybody who's here live to tell me if any of these are relatable. This is all anecdotal. We have no data on this, but we're just watching this phenomenon. But we're noticing these 3 ways that a lot of motivated folks showed up at the beginning of COVID. Either the hiding response, which is just the like, I can't even watch the news for 1 second. I can't look at Facebook. I just want to be under the covers all day long. Nobody talk to me. This is too much, right? We also see the hyper productivity, the need to do the most, especially right out of the gate. So when COVID got big in the US, the United States back in March, a lot of people were suddenly really inspired to be in leadership roles. If you were already the leader, you might felt very comfortable stepping up for your team or helping people navigate through this. And then the third H we see a lot is what we've been calling hula hooping. And the hula hooping is where you're just doing little bits of each task all day long, but you can't quite finish any one of them. It's like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this. And at the end of the day, you're exhausted, and yet you're thinking, okay, but how much do I have to show for it? So nobody has to tell me which one of those are relatable, but if any of those are relatable, give a comment in the chat or raise a hand and let everybody else know that we're in this together. I share that because there's nothing wrong with each of those three H's: the hula hooping, the hiding, the hyper productivity. Thank you, Amy. I see you. The difference is whether or not we do them intentionally, right? So the hiding is productive when we know we need a moment of respite. Then that's a great thing to do, right? Or the hyper productivity, if it's like, you know what, I just can't sit still and do nothing about this, I'm going to clean out my garage. Great, right? Or the sense of hula hooping, if I can do a little bit of this at a time, but then I need a break. And I can watch the news for 15 minutes, but then I need to breathe for 5 minutes, or whatever it is. They all have a light and a shadow side. But this is really an opportunity for us to create our own rules, right? And to tap into our own self-sourced guidance system. Because if we had any illusion that somebody on our planet had the master plan, I think that illusion has been tampered with a little bit. And we're clear that now more than ever is the moment for some of the information that we use to make our decisions to be self-sourced, meaning to come from within ourselves. So this is really an opportunity to tap back in to what one of the guests on our show calls, Susie Banksbaum, she called it your holy knowing. And I love that, with no religious connotation, just this idea of we do know things. And if we've been relying on other people to be our guiding posts, now is a really good time to check in with what you know. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And people can thank you, Amy, for putting up your thumb.
Drew, I see
and
Drew.
Drew and Shelley, and okay, we've definitely. So we're getting a number of questions mounting here. Before I go to our community, now more than ever, to use a phrase commonly used right now, people are deciding to make big changes. It's like, again, since everything else has been questioned, thrown up in the air, and uncertain for this time, there are many people saying, why not? And when you and I were doing the podcast last week and you asked me what I would ask your community, I said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And for me, that's about men, women, any age. What would you do? And in this particular time, this is the time to do that, whatever that is, and not have our traditional boundaries pop up of I can't do that, or it's too late, or I should have done this, or I didn't major in that. That's not going to help. All of what has been your experience working with clients and your community now that you've learned so much from them over the number of podcasts you've done, as it regards this pretty significant change that people are willing to make in their lives, whether it's career and a vocation or an avocation?
That is such a good question. When I started Everybody Thrive, I started it just a couple of years before the housing crisis and the housing bubble burst in the United States. And I remember being a little bit scared of, okay, who's going to have money to hire a coach or a wellness person now? What's going to happen? And I've watched then, and I'm watching it happen again with this type of crisis, even though it's a different format, is that every time there's a big, major global issue, and I think also for a lot of us as individuals, when we go through something big or traumatic, there's this back to basics movement that happens. There's this call to simplify. It's like a sacred interruption, something that might have been whispering to us, ooh, I want to do this differently, or ooh, I want to change this, suddenly gets loud. To use Mary Halpin, who is the friend who's here, who originally introduced me to Linda, who'd introduced me to you, Michaela. Mary talks about hearing those whispers, here's the whisper. And so I think when the world suddenly, a hush came upon us, we all began to hear our whisper a little bit louder. And I noticed that the clients of mine who did particularly well, a lot of my clients made big radical career changes 6 or 8 months before the virus hit that ironically set them up to be able to be particularly nimble when it happened, because they had a practice of tapping in and listening to their gut or their intuition or their hunch or their higher guidance or whatever they call it. Everyone's got a different phrase for it. But there was something that gave them a heads up that now might be a time to make a shift. And so I think for those of us who were particularly busy or we had a lot going on, that shift was made for us, which is particularly jarring. But I think that the folks who I'm witnessing who are navigating this well are deciding to be thoughtful about the decisions they make next. And I know I really judged myself, and I'm curious if this happened for anybody else, especially in leadership roles. When COVID started happening and now everyone's offering a free online course, back in March on all these different topics, and there's all these resources being shared. And I was just judging the crap out of myself for not having anything to offer so quickly on the spot. I didn't have a brilliant idea. I didn't have like a life hack. I didn't have the quick, easy fix. And it took me weeks to realize, yeah, I'm not the quick, easy fix gal. Like, that's not my bag. I do the long-term transformation thing. I need time to think. So that was for me a little tapping in of like, yeah, Karlee, you do better when you have time to process. It's going to take longer for you. So that's my example, right? But I think for a lot of people, and I'd be really curious for anybody here, what's one thing that you're clearer about yourself that you didn't know even just a year ago? What's one thing that you know now that you didn't know 6 or 8 months ago that'll inform your future decisions, right? What is one thing that I'm wiser of now? I'd be so curious to hear.
Well, Shelley, would you like to look into the several questions that we have mounting from the community and take a couple?
Well, the first question is from one of our MVPs and also last week's recent guest, Drew. So I'm just going to unmute you and have you ask it yourself, if you're down with that. Can you, or you unmute yourself?
So hi, great talk. This is just wonderful. I'm going back to the thing with Drake, that philosophy. So when I was a sales manager recently for a very high-end Fortune 500 globally, big, just global company. And I tried that philosophy with a sales team that I was managing, and it was really rejected from above, from the corporate level. So I just wondered if you're seeing any changes out there in corporate America. And, this was, again, a sales team that when I took it over was last in the company, last in the whole country. I should say not company, but country. And we stuck to our guns with that philosophy and became number one in a year. It just, everybody was just, they were different people. So I just wondered what you're seeing out there in corporate America.
That's a great one. I'm seeing the vast majority in my own personal experience. I'm seeing everyone's a little bit more tender right now, which has been a great asset, and that people are more likely to be vulnerable. And we were talking earlier before we went live about, being on Zoom and watching corporate meetings through Zoom means you see people's toddlers run through the room. You see their dog jump up. You see their aging parents who they're taking care of walk through in their underpants in the back of the room, right? And so that ability to put up our armor and go to work is really faltering. That said, I will say there's a percentage of the people that I work with that are pretty entrenched, where I am now aware that, they're really not open to change. And so I think we're all getting a little bit better at, I'm calling it the Godzilla effect. So, like the old Godzilla movies, and it was, originally in Japanese, so it was dubbed over in English. So when they talk in the English version, the words don't quite match the actions. And I think that's what I'm seeing now with corporate America, or with any of my particular clients. I am clearer about whose words are matching their actions. And when in doubt, I trust the actions. The actions are always accurate representation of what somebody believes in and what they're willing to stand up for. And so I hope that answers the question a little bit, Drew. I think we're all getting a little bit better at spotting the Godzilla effect, of spotting, does this person really believe what they're saying? Are they taking actions that are in alignment with that? Or are they just really good at saying the politically correct thing or the socially, justice thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Shelley?
We have a comment from Anita. It says, all intermittently as what to accomplish combined with self-care, reflection, connection, give oneself permission to recognize the flows and emotional impact. I did all three.
That's
Thank you.
beautiful, Anita. Thank you for that.
Thank
I have a
you.
question for you, Karlee. I heard in a recent interview, I believe you were talking about the power of the intellect, how we often, or people in general, but that we choose our intellect in moments when we default almost to intellect instead of being in touch with what's happening with us physically. And I'm not saying it as well as you were, but can you talk a little bit about that kind of mind-body connection?
Absolutely. So what we're finding is that we all have a myriad of resources available to us. And why not be the most resourced we can be, right? We all do better when our resource cup is full. That said, for a lot of folks who are particularly driven, we find that we bank on our intellect as our main or only resource, and we forget about the rest of the resources available to us. And so our body is one. There's 5 main resources that we see on a regular basis. There's kind of our spiritual pillar, our relational pillar, our physical body, our intellect, our emotional pillar. These are all things that we can tap into, and our body gives us information. So there's a few main things that almost every driven client that I have has when we first begin to work together. And almost every client, if not every client I've ever had, has some type of perplexing health symptom. And these are things that they used to be able to pop an aspirin for, and now they can't get away with that. It's not cutting it anymore. They've been to the doctor, they have a relatively clean bill of health, and yet they're getting these extreme migraines or digestive issues or reproductive health issues, or their autoimmune disorder is continually flaring up. And these are a lot of things that, again, this is information that's there to help inform our decisions. And for a lot of driven folks, the only time we slow down is when our body makes us. Mm-hmm. And I know me as somebody who suffers from, I used to suffer from severe extreme migraines on a regular basis, and got all the CAT scans and tried a lot of medications, and none of them were working. And it wasn't until I was laying on my back, laid up again, in my early 20s, and it occurred to me that that was the only time I rested. Oh, like maybe my body isn't trying to hold me back. Maybe my body's trying to tell me something. And so whether it's the spidey sense you get in your fingers when you can tell whether or not something's true, or the hair standing up on the back of your neck, or the heartburn that flares, or whatever it is, we have this great communication device built into us that's incredibly powerful, that we have an opportunity to connect with if we're willing to sit with it, if we're willing to, in a safe situation, this is not me giving medical advice, but in a situation where you know it's okay to listen to your body, to do just that and ask it what it wants you to know. Like, okay, body, I've got a knot in my stomach. What are you trying to tell me right now? But here's the kicker. When it tells you something, believe it. That's the really important part, because there'll be all these ways we try to circumvent our knowing. And I know that I still do this on a regular basis. I just did it last week with somebody where I thought, in fact, it was about a COVID situation. It was the movers showed up at my house and they didn't have their masks on. And it's really big where I am right now. And so it's important to me to have a mask on. And I thought immediately, it's just this one time. I'm sure it's safe. It's just one person. And here's all the ways I'm circumventing my knowing. My knowing is I am not comfortable with this person who's a professional mover, who's in a lot of homes, being in my home without a mask right now. But here's all the ways my intellect will try to circumvent what my body knows to be true. And so that's just one of the ways that we're watching people have a lot of success in our modern economy. And I think a lot of us have different versions of that, whether we call it a gut instinct or a hunch or whatever term we use. But this is a valuable piece of information. It's a resource that's available to us that's worth exploring, if nothing else, inviting it to the conversation when we're making decisions.
Okay, but then what about fight or flight? Then you have a dilemma. You can't fight and flight.
I love that. So there's this great piece of research. You're taking me on a side tangent, but bear with me, because there's this great body of research that's coming out about this fight or flight response, which we've all learned, and I've been studying for a long time. But there's been a group of researchers at a few universities, and I'll find a link to the study and share it with you later, that have found that those initial studies were done mostly on men. And so the fight or flight response is actually a testosterone-based response. As they study more women in their stress response, they find different hormones are actually released at different times. Women are more likely to have what they call the tend and befriend response to stress, which means they actually feel a need to stop and tend to it, or they want to invite help. They want to talk to a friend about it. They want somebody to help process with them. Now, anecdotally, maybe this is why it's hard for men and women when they're lost in the car to stop and ask for directions, right? Because there's the fight or flight person over here that's just like, well, I want to figure this out and get out of here. And there's the tend and befriend person over here that's like, well, let's just ask somebody for directions, right? And so this is a great way of looking at things, is we're learning a lot about how studies haven't always included women in the conversation. And so there is the fight or flight response, and there's also this tend and befriend response. So when in doubt, Shelley, my first go-to move is always to get 3% more nourished. Then I have a more accurate representation of what's real and true. What does my body need when I'm getting information from it? Does it need something to drink? Does it need a warm blanket? Does it need to sit still? Does it need to go for a walk? Does it need a shower? And then I'll make my decision, right? But I love your point about if we sense that flight or fight or that tend and befriend response are there influencing our decision-making process, it's not the sign to rush the decision. It's the sign to dare to pause, right? And can I give my body what it needs for a moment so that my nervous system can switch back to its sympathetic state? Or parasympathetic state, I'm sorry, and be a little bit more thoughtful.
So Shonda in our community asks, is the cortisol dopamine gender-based?
Oh, good question. So those are hormones that are in all of our bodies, right? But what we watch happen specifically with women is that they have an initial hit of the cortisol that we get for that fight or flight response. And then the estrogen begins to interact with that, and it creates a dopamine reaction in the body. Like that's the next hormone that's signaled, which is one of our feel-good hormones, right? That's one of our human connection hormones. And it's followed by oxytocin. And oxytocin is all about meaningful human connection. That is a sensation that we usually get when we feel close to somebody. So it's just neat to watch the way that this plays out in different bodies. And I think the moral of the story is there is no one hard, fast way that we all respond. And so all the more reason to get clear about ourselves as individuals and what we know to be true, and to trust that.
Excellent. Shelley?
We had a comment, which I think is it's interesting, from Shonda, saying, when I was on maternity leave, it mostly meant I worked remotely, audio only in those days. And I found my decision process differed from when I was in the office. My thinking was more compartmentalized in the office than when I was working from home. I wonder if others have found that. Now, I certainly have. I said immediately, if that makes sense.
I'm fascinated by that, Shonda. I want to hear more about that. You're reminding me that I know it's logical to think of ourselves as fragments. This is work me, and this is home me, and this is friend me, and this is spouse me, and this is, partner me, and this is volunteer me, and this is the me that does the grocery shopping. And the truth is, while that works well in our brain, we're all one whole being. We are each one whole being. And if we have a little bit of space, if we have these pockets of time to integrate, we might see things differently. And I wonder, Shonda, I'm curious to hear from you if that's part of it, right? That having just that much more space between you and your coworkers gives you a little bit more wiggle room to be you.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Shonda, please.
Respond. So I'm kind of fascinated by this, because I definitely found when I was working full time that and my kids noticed it. My husband noticed it. I had a different persona. Not that I wasn't the same person, but what you put front and center. So, talking about a lens or whatever it might be. But I'm just wondering, with everybody on Zoom now, as you mentioned, what triggered it was, you mentioned people, it's either dogs coming back and forth, the cat crawling on their face, or the kids jumping in. And especially men tend to be really embarrassed and apologetic. Oh, I'm so sorry that I have children that have wandered into the room, right? But it occurs to me that in that environment, you can't just have the one face anymore. Although I more with men than with women, but the men tend to like shove the kids out the door, slam the door, whatever. They try to stay with their game face on, right? So I'm all about power, positive thinking, silver lining. Are we in this COVID time? Are we actually have an opportunity to, because people can't just be one face? And I'm wondering if other people have seen that as a benefit, because most people that I know that are Zoom a lot hate Zoom these days. We're all tired of Zoom, right? We want to actually see and feel and smell people. But I'm wondering if that might not be a benefit.
I love that. Shannon, you just exemplified dipping our toes in the pond of what is good. That's exactly it. Because there's something very grounded and real about the way you address this. And this would be important to acknowledge, is that, you know, we can be inappropriately optimistic, or at least I know I can be, right? We can bypass to that and not acknowledge the reality of what's happening. And that's not the goal, right? The goal isn't to check out from reality. The goal is to have our feet on the earth, to be grounded and able to lean towards that positive thinking. So the reality is, man, Zoom is a gift, and it's really tricky to be on it all day long. Gosh, I wish I could just go hug my people. And I'm learning things about colleagues that I've never known before. And I'll give you one funny story. I won't tell this client's name, but I was in a board meeting with a client.
Come on, Karlee.
Well, it's a little embarrassing, but he was telling me, he said, Karlee, I was closing a deal over Zoom, you know, and normally he would be doing this in his office. And I was closing a deal over Zoom, and I was talking to my client, and I found out that he has 2 college-age kids, and he never knew that before. And they've had a working relationship for 20 years. Wow. And he never knew that this colleague had children. And I've been thinking, what are you guys talking about for 20 years then? Like, what have you been talking about, right? But for this gentleman, this was the game changer. It opened his eyes to what I think, Shonda, you're talking about here a little bit of, oh, this person has children and a life, and so do I, and we're more in common. And he said the sales pitch entirely changed course. They ended up finding a win-win solution with a lot less effort. And now they're a lot closer. They look forward to talking to one another. And so I love this example.
I would also posit that we're all vulnerable. And I mean, we're all equally, we're, you know, different levels of vulnerable, but we are all vulnerable. And so we show up, it's an even playing field. We show up together, and I mean, certainly in this forum, but I mean, you know, we show up and it's everybody's on the same, you know, coming from the same place. And I think we are a little bit more vulnerable, and then we're open to listening better, I think.
Well, and I mean, even as exemplified on this screen that each of you see, just like I do, there are those who, you know, are in whatever room in their house where they Zoom. And because that connection of being, you know, seen, not just their picture, and I'm not shaming anybody who just has their picture up, Tom Flynn, that would be just because it's still, you know, that this is 9 o'clock East Coast time, not that you aren't on 9 o'clock, but, you know, it's like we have to just be okay, right, with whatever that interface is. A lot of us just need, in whatever messy or magnificent or somewhere in between we are, just to be able to be there. But the connection I'm finding in a meeting Shelley and I had today, and I definitely was too messy to be on the screen. And could you tell it really bugged him? He's like, okay, well, I can't wait to meet you really, Michaela. Now, I'm not going to say anything different.
He was throwing some shade, for sure. He was throwing some shade.
Yeah. I just said, I need to see the person not just that picture, but the words are coming from this person. So I think, you know, that's just the reality that it's showing up. And like we've seen on many of the fun commercials, it doesn't matter what you're wearing below the waist. It just, as long as it might be something. And then Drew just added, which is why I was laughing hysterically a moment ago, is that let's not pull a Jeffrey Toobin.
Yeah.
You remind me that I hope we don't go back to normal. Like I think what was normal was a little dysfunctional, right? It was normal to be fragmented, and it was normal to armor up to go to work, and it was normal to only talk about certain things and not talk about social justice in the workplace or whatever it is. And I don't think that any of that stuff is actually particularly normal. It was normal to go to breakneck pace. I don't think that that's the goal, right? The goal isn't to go back to what was normal. I think you're talking about finding ways to stay authentic. Is that the word? Right? And I know that that's a buzzword, and there's a lot of hype around the concept of being authentic. And there's a big difference between being authentic and just airing all of our dirty laundry. But I think that, at least for the folks that I'm watching who are doing well, they have stopped trying to go back to what was. Like, that's done. Like, they are aware that there's a moment here to pause and to grieve the change and to acknowledge the culmination of one way of being, but also to have our sights on what makes sense next. What is the ideal new normal for each of us as individuals, for us as corporations, for us as countries? What is the new normal?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think that, as I was saying before, one of the things that I found so great about the different podcasts, and I haven't listened to all of them, or I would have had nothing else I could have done in the last.
Yeah, that's way too much. Yeah.
So prolific, and I encourage everybody to listen to at least a few of Karlee's podcasts, because they're just they're a blinding glimpse of the obvious in a way that has you saying, yes, but I didn't remember that, right? Like, of course that makes sense, but that wasn't present in my mind because we have operated so differently for so long that your podcast and this conversation hopefully is a reminder for everybody that, well, there are still, the ugly underbelly of all the things that have happened and are happening in 2020. There are really good things. And the "and" to me is one of the most important lessons that each of us can take away, Karlee. It's that, yes, all this, and that's not okay, and that's bad, or that feels crappy. And we are learning things. We are touching each other in a different way. We are sharing things and finding out things that we didn't know from colleagues of 20 years. So there's a lot that creates the next normal, not the old normal, but the new normal. So we have about 4 minutes. Are there any other questions? I don't want to leave anybody out here.
Well, I think Shonda's, I think you're celebrating the curated books in the background. Are we talking sort of the PBS NewsHour? But Mark Shields is in a closet, like that's at an angle. Some of them are.
No, I just felt I didn't want to be the unencumbered optimist, but people still put on a facade even on Zoom. Although we're seeing more whole people, but especially on the media side because they're used to doing it. But I have noticed I love taking a screenshot and then just reading through what people's books are, and that it's done deliberately I think in most cases because they're just too perfect.
Right.
Listen, I'd like to be in that ring light business that everybody uses to make us look all aglow. That should have bought stock in that.
They are probably sold out.
Yeah, probably.
I need one and I don't have one, so.
Well, Karlee, are there any other pearls of wisdom you want to leave us before we conclude and tell everybody what we're doing next week?
Well, I would be really curious if it's okay to hear from the folks here, even if you just want to type it in the chat. What's one takeaway for you? What's one word or phrase or concept that you're going to carry with you? Because I'm of the philosophy that in order for things to be doable, they have to be really simple, or else I don't do them. And so I'm curious, if we made it super simple, you don't need to remember everything we spoke about, but what's the word, the phrase, whether it's something that bubbled up within you or it's something you heard somebody else say, but what's in the room? Amy said surrender. This is something that we do. I run a group coaching program called the Reclaiming Time Studio, specifically for women. And this is something we do at the end of each call. We do this What's the one thing that landed? And there's a few of those women here tonight, which is really special. Anita said, fight or flight versus tend and nurture. The body's knowing, Mary. Connect, said Shelley. Permission for self-care. Heck yeah, Alexandra, right? And not permission from me. This is permission from you to you, right? Self-care is part of a professional growth strategy. There is no business without our body. They are not separate things. Your body is the most important part of your career. And so when we see those things as interrelated, sometimes that's really helpful for those of us who are career motivated to know that, oh, when I drink water or when I let myself go to bed, that's actually me investing, right, in my business. Yeah.
Linda, it says Ed Schroeder, excuse me, but she said dare to pause.
Daring to pause. We talk about that a lot on the podcast and in my practice. I hope, Linda, that we get to talk about that more. And thank you for making tonight possible, Linda.
And I love from Drew, I have no flaws, only attributes. Love
Way to
it.
go, Drew. That's the
Way
way.
to go,
That's
Drew.
the pond. That's the pond right there.
And back to
Yes.
Shonda on X and Y.
I love that.
And for all of you men, I know you'd only be secure if you were in our collective conscience community. So I can say that my late mother, when my father would do something that she just could not explain, she'd say, oh, well, it's that incomplete X in his genetic code. So, Karlee, thank you so, so much. I know this will just be the beginning of a very long connection. Thank you, Mary Halpin. Thank you, Linda Hayes. Wonderful. And you are now, whether you like it or not, an inextricably linked part of our community, Karlee. And we are there for you, and we appreciate you being there for us. So thank you on behalf of everyone. And all of you, please know that as we near the end of 2020, thank God. Anyway, sorry, that we have about 4 collective conscience salons left. 5, excuse me, Shelley. 5, correct?
5, yeah.
And so next week, it is going to start the season of giving in a conversation with the CEO and president of the Sonoma Community Foundation about needing and giving all at the same time. It's going to be a great conversation. So please do join us, and make sure you go to Messy and Magnificent, the podcast, to check out even more of Karlee Fain. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night and a great week.
Everyone, good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.